Hello, friends. Are you watching this alone or with someone? Tell me in the comments.
The roast was dry, the wine too warm, and my mother's holiday centerpiece looked like it had been resurrected from a church funeral in the early 90s. Red carnations, fake pine needles, and one of those battery-powered candles flickering in a way that made it seem like even the candle was trying to escape this dinner. But all of that was background noise, the kind of familiar discomfort you expect when you've been raised in a family that defines holiday spirit as passive aggression and old grudges wrapped in glittery bows. I had barely touched my food, not because I wasn't hungry, I was, but because something in the air felt heavy, like a pressure drop before a storm. My father, Frank, sat at the head of the table like some retired general, watching everyone with that half squint he used when he thought he was smarter than the rest of us. My mother, Carol, sat on his right, doing what she did best, pretending nothing was wrong while silently judging the angle of my napkin. My brother Kyle, 2 years younger and twice as lost, was nursing his third glass of wine and cracking his neck like he was preparing for a courtroom cross-examination. But it was Christmas. I was home. And I had promised myself I wouldn't start anything, not this year. So when my father cleared his throat and stood up, glass raised in one hand like a judge about to deliver a sentence, I just smiled, that tight practice smile you give when you know someone's about to insult you, but you want to look calm enough to make them nervous. "I've been thinking," he said, already slurring the edges of his vowels, which meant he'd had at least 2 scotches before the Pinot even hit the table. "This family's done too much enabling, too much unnecessary support." He paused, looking right at me as if the stuffing on my plate had personally offended him. "So, we've decided. It's time you learned responsibility. No more handouts, Emily. We're cutting you off." The fork never made it to my mouth. I lowered it slowly, set it down with deliberate care on the edge of the plate, and let the silence do the heavy lifting. Kyle looked up like a raccoon caught raiding a trash can. Mom blinked once, then twice, as if her contacts were betraying her. Dad, he just stood there, smug and proud, like he'd delivered the punchline to a joke he'd been rehearsing all week. Now here's the part they didn't expect. I didn't cry, I didn't argue. I didn't do that thing I used to do, that people-pleasing scramble to stay in the will or in their good graces. No, I leaned back, picked up my own glass, and said with a calm that even surprised me, "I already did, Dad. That's why the mortgage is now in my name." The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was stunned, almost theatrical, like someone had hit mute on the whole room. Mom's fork slipped out of her hand and clattered against the plate. Kyle choked on his wine, coughing and muttering something under his breath. Dad, though, he didn't flinch, just blinked slowly, calculating. But I saw it, that flicker of confusion behind the eyes, that hesitation. He hadn't seen this coming. "You... what?" my mother finally said, her voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard since I was 16, and told her I didn't believe in God anymore. "I paid you back," I said plainly, "over the last 3 years, every cent you ever put into this place. Bought you out, quietly, because I figured someday you'd pull this little stunt. And I didn't feel like being emotionally blackmailed over mashed potatoes anymore." Kyle looked like he wanted to disappear into the gravy boat. He always hated confrontation, which was ironic given how many he started with his screw-ups. Mom was staring at me now like she was trying to solve a math equation that didn't have a solution. Dad, still standing, finally lowered his glass but didn't sit down. "You went behind our backs?" he asked, tone low and controlled, like he was trying to maintain some kind of parental dignity. It was almost cute, in a tragic sort of way. "No," I said. "I stopped pretending this house was yours to control." He looked around the room like it might agree with him. Like the walls would rise up and remind me who raised me, who gave me shelter, who taught me to tie my damn shoes. But the house didn't speak. And neither did my mother. "I have the papers in the drawer behind you," I added, "right next to your prized carving knife." And that was when I realized I'd won something. Not approval, not even peace. Just leverage. For the first time in my adult life, I had wrestled the power away from the 2 people who had always made me feel like I owed them something just for existing. You could cut the tension in that dining room with the butter knife I never touched. No one moved. No one said anything. It was like the truth had sucked all the oxygen out of the air, and they were choking on the absence of their own control. But the thing about people like my father is, they don't like losing. They especially don't like losing to someone they raised. And so, even with the truth hanging in the air like smoke after a fire, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He sat down slowly, adjusting his napkin like he still had some kind of command over the situation, and said, "Well, that's a hell of a way to ruin Christmas." I leaned in just a bit, met his eyes, and said, "You started it." And then I picked up my fork and finally took a bite of that dry-ass roast. It tasted better than anything I'd eaten in years. Not because it was good, but because it was mine. The thing is, you can only be someone's puppet for so long before you start to wonder what it's like to cut the strings. And once they're gone, you don't miss the wait. You just start walking. But what they didn't know, and what I hadn't decided until that moment, was that this dinner was only the beginning. And I had more secrets in that house than they were ready to hear. The first time I realized my family didn't see me as a person, but more as an extension of their narrative, was probably somewhere around my 12th birthday, though I wouldn't have had the vocabulary to explain it then. What I remember clearly is that I asked for a bike. Nothing outrageous, just a simple red Schwinn like the one my best friend Olivia had. I got a dictionary, a hardback Merriam-Webster, with a little note inside that said, "Words are power." I was supposed to be grateful. Kyle, on the other hand, got a Game Boy and a set of football pads 3 months later, just because he said he wanted to try a new vibe. That's the kind of household we had, one where I was expected to deserve what I got, and Kyle was allowed to explore who he might become. That pattern didn't break with adulthood. If anything, it calcified. I went to community college while Kyle spent 2 semesters at Arizona State before being medically withdrawn after what Dad called an incident with a girl who misunderstood his intentions. I'll never forget how calmly Mom said, "Boys make mistakes, Emily. It's part of growing into men." That's what she said while I worked double shifts at the diner just to pay for books. Because I chose not to go to a real university. My real crime was that I didn't need rescuing. And in this family, if you didn't need to be saved, then you weren't useful. When I bought my first house, a modest 2-bedroom with peeling paint and a toilet that whined like a dying animal, it wasn't with their help. I saved, worked, and scraped together every penny until I could swing a down payment. But when I called to tell them, I didn't get congratulations. I got a lecture. My father said, "You should have waited. You'll never keep up with that kind of responsibility without support." Then, and only then, did he offer to invest by covering part of the mortgage, but only if we put the deed in his name too. At the time, I said yes because it felt like a lifeline. I was 26, tired, and stupidly hopeful that this was a sign they were finally on my side. I didn't see the hook buried under all that bait. What followed were years of conditional help. They'd pay the property tax, but only if I consulted them before any home improvements. Dad once made me fax him the receipt for a damn garbage disposal before he'd send the reimbursement. Mom used to stop by just to see how things were holding up, but she'd spend the whole visit adjusting my picture frames and muttering about how the living room felt too cold, too empty, too single. Meanwhile, Kyle had burned through 2 apartments, a failed startup, and a DUI, and still got bailed out faster than I could get a plumber to return my calls. There was this night, I remember it too clearly now, when I was 33. My car had broken down, and I called Dad because I didn't know what else to do. It was freezing out, and I had just finished a closing shift. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the phone. I told him I needed help. I didn't ask for money, just a ride. He said, "Maybe it's time you learn to stop relying on other people." I hung up and sat in that dark parking lot until a tow truck driver offered to let me sit in his cab for warmth. That was the night I realized I didn't have parents. I had creditors who liked to call themselves family. From that point on, I changed. Quietly but completely. I started putting money away in a separate account. I took a freelance bookkeeping job on top of my regular hours, handling invoices and payroll for a small landscaping business. I didn't sleep much, I didn't date. I didn't talk about it, but I worked. And over time, I scraped together enough to start buying back what they'd claimed. I tracked every penny they had ever put toward the house, added interest, and began paying them back. One transfer at a time, each labeled loan repayment to make the paper trail crystal clear. My dad never read the memos. He thought I was sending gifts. "Look who's being generous," he once joked on the phone. "Did you win the lottery?" I smiled and said, "Something like that." By the time I was 39, I had cleared the total amount, plus a small surplus for interest. Then I filed paperwork to have the deed amended, quietly, legally, and I said nothing to them because they didn't deserve the courtesy. They had taught me to associate love with conditions, generosity with strings, and help with humiliation. So I paid them back on their terms, cold, transactional, and final. Still, I waited for them to spring the trap again. And when Christmas came around and Dad made his little announcement, I wasn't even angry. I was ready. Because for the first time in my life, I had built something without their fingerprints all over it. I had earned my life, every inch of it. But here's the thing. Secrets don't stay secrets in families like mine. They fester. They sit in the corner like uninvited guests, quiet but watching, and sometimes they start whispering to the wrong people. So as Kyle stared at me over that Christmas dinner table, wine-stained and startled, I saw something in his eyes that chilled me. Not confusion, not betrayal, something else. Recognition, like he knew exactly what I had done, and maybe even why. And that scared me more than anything. Because if Kyle knew, then someone had talked. And in my family, when someone talks, they always have a price. It started as a whisper in the back of my mind. That quiet, gnawing voice that said, "You can't keep living like this." I would come home after work, kick off my shoes, stare at the walls of a house that never felt like mine, and feel the weight of something I couldn't name pressing into my chest. The mortgage bill came with my name on it, sure, but also theirs, Frank and Carol Haywood, etched in black ink like a stamp of ownership, a reminder of who really held the reins. Every month, I sent off a payment for a life that didn't feel like freedom, and every month I felt like I was buying permission to exist. The day I decided to change that wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no revelation, no glass of wine slammed against a wall. It was a Tuesday, I think. Rainy. I had just opened my credit union app to check my balance, and for the first time, the number wasn't embarrassing. I had skipped dinners out, ignored vacation emails from airlines, said no to every impulse purchase I could. My fridge was a graveyard of expired condiments, but my savings had grown into something that didn't look laughable. It was small, but it was enough. I called a mortgage specialist that afternoon during my break and asked what it would take to buy out my co-owners. I had to say it twice. The woman on the phone didn't understand why someone would want to buy back their own house from their parents. But I was polite. I didn't tell her that co-owner was a euphemism in my case, a nicer way to say hostage. She explained the refinancing process in detail, walked me through my credit requirements, and gave me a checklist. I printed that list out and pinned it behind my spice rack. Every time I crushed garlic or sprinkled paprika, I saw it. A silent contract between me and the life I wanted. The logistics took months. I gathered pay stubs, filed tax returns, navigated the absolute circus of appraisals and inspections. I didn't tell my parents a word. I knew if I gave them even a whiff of my plan, they'd find some way to stall it or sabotage it. I kept it quiet, clean, methodical. And slowly, like chipping away at rusted chains, I moved forward. Frank and Carol had no idea I had started sending them checks marked loan repayment because they were always too distracted by Kyle's latest catastrophe. That worked to my advantage. Kyle had just crashed his second car in 6 months, drunk again, but managed to sweet-talk the cop into letting him off with a fine and a suspended license. He came to my house that night, slurring apologies and asking if he could crash on the couch. I said no. It was one of the first times I'd ever denied him anything. He stared at me like I'd slapped him, then muttered something under his breath about how I'd changed. That word stuck with me. Changed. Like I was supposed to stay frozen in time. The same reliable fixer, the fallback girl. After 6 months of slow, careful movement, the loan was approved. I wired the final amount to my parents' joint account and sent them a certified letter with the paperwork. In it, I wrote clearly, "This payment concludes my obligation to the joint ownership of the property at 112 Baxter Drive." Enclosed is documentation of the refinancing process and title amendment. I included a sticky note, not out of pettiness, but finality. It said, "Thank you for your support. I no longer need it." I kept the amended title in the kitchen drawer, the one where my father always stored the carving knives. It felt symbolic in a way I didn't want to unpack too deeply. Power, precision, and blood, tucked neatly beside the proof that I had finally carved something of my own. When Christmas came and Frank made his grand announcement, I wasn't just prepared, I was almost amused. For years, I had let them dangle the illusion of support over me like a carrot, like I was some half-trained animal waiting for treats. But now, the leash was off, and the game had flipped. His smug little speech about cutting me off would have gutted me a few years ago. Now it was almost funny. A desperate last move by someone who didn't realize the board had shifted. What I hadn't anticipated was the look on Kyle's face. That mixture of confusion and fear that didn't match the situation. At first, I thought it was just sibling shock. He had always assumed I'd be the one holding the family together, the good daughter, the safe one. But something in his eyes made me pause. It was like he knew. Not just that I'd paid them back, but something deeper. Something he wasn't supposed to know. Something he hadn't meant to let slip. I confronted him the next day, cornered him in the garage while he was sneaking a cigarette like we were teenagers again. He denied it at first, tried to play dumb, but Kyle has a tell. He scratches the back of his neck when he lies. He was practically bleeding back there. Finally, I asked straight up, "Did you know I bought them out before last night?" His eyes flinched. Just a flicker, but enough. "I heard them talking," he muttered, barely audible. "A few weeks ago. Thought it was about something else. Figured you'd tell me if it mattered." I stared at him, the fury rising, not because he knew, but because he didn't say anything. Because once again, Kyle kept secrets to protect himself, not anyone else. It was like a pattern baked into his DNA. And I wondered, how many other things had he overheard and kept quiet about over the years? But I didn't push, not yet. Something about the way he said it didn't sit right. It felt rehearsed, like there was more to it than he was letting on. That's the thing about secrets in families like mine. They're not always hidden in the dark. Sometimes they're just sitting out in the open, dressed up like normalcy, waiting for someone brave or pissed off enough to actually look. And I was finally ready to look. I've always known my brother was a liar, not in the way children fib to stay out of trouble, but in the deeper, more insidious sense that he never really believed the truth mattered unless it served him. Growing up, Kyle had this uncanny ability to make people bend toward him, to spin half facts into full stories and sell them as gospel, especially to our parents. He could crash a bike and say it was stolen, fail a test and blame the teacher, get caught sneaking out and convince mom he was just taking a walk to clear his head. And somehow, he always walked away clean, while I was the one left apologizing on behalf of the family, patching the emotional drywall he punched holes in. The days after Christmas were thick with silence. My parents didn't bring up the ownership revelation again, and I didn't press the matter either, though the tension in the air felt like a stretched rubber band, always one wrong move from snapping. Kyle hung around longer than usual, pretending to help clean up, loitering near the living room like a dog that had chewed through something and wasn't sure if you'd noticed yet. He was nervous, not in the obvious way, but in that fidgety, half-distracted rhythm that gave away his guilt long before he opened his mouth. On the second day after Christmas, I caught him standing in my bedroom while I was in the kitchen making coffee. He tried to play it off, said he was looking for the bathroom, which was ridiculous, considering he'd used the same one down the hall for 30 years. I didn't say anything. I just stared at him until he walked out with his shoulders hunched and his eyes darting, like a raccoon that had tried the fridge and found nothing but leftovers and regret. That was when I knew he was looking for something. The documents, maybe, proof that I'd taken control. Or maybe he was searching for something else, something he wasn't supposed to see in the first place. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling back to the way he looked at me during dinner, the weird mix of guilt and familiarity in his expression. So I got up, poured myself a finger of bourbon, and pulled out a box from the back of the hall closet. It was where I kept my emergency stash of old receipts, warranties, and the few legal documents that hadn't fit into the drawer in the kitchen. As I was flipping through the files, I realized something was missing, an envelope I'd labeled with blue marker, the one that contained copies of the loan agreements I'd sent to our parents. It wasn't there. I searched the entire box twice. It didn't make sense. I hadn't touched that envelope in months. The only people who even knew about it, theoretically, were me, the bank, and, if he'd been snooping, Kyle. A slow burn started crawling up the back of my neck. I wasn't just angry, I was scared. Because if Kyle had taken it, it meant he was planning something, or worse, someone else had taken it, and I didn't know who or why. The next morning, I confronted him directly. He was half asleep on the couch, covered in one of Mom's ancient Afghans, reeking of cheap beer and resentment. I stood in front of him, arms crossed, and asked, "What did you do with the envelope?" He blinked at me like he didn't understand the words, then sat up too fast and winced like the motion hurt. "What envelope?" he asked, feigning innocence so clumsily it made my stomach twist. "You know damn well which one. It was in the closet with all the loan documentation, my payments, the title change. It's gone. And you're the only one who's been snooping." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that used to make girls swoon when we were in high school, but now just made him look like a man clinging to charm that didn't age well. "I didn't touch anything," he said, voice flat, but his knee was bouncing, betraying him. "You're a terrible liar," I said, and he looked at me with a mix of shame and something colder, resentment maybe, or envy. "I didn't touch your envelope," he repeated, and then added, "But maybe you should check on your jewelry box." That threw me. I had no idea what the hell he was talking about, but the way he said it, with this slow, calculated smirk, made it clear that whatever it wasn't random. I walked straight to my room, yanked open the top drawer of my dresser, and opened the small velvet-lined box that held the few nice things I owned: 2 rings, a gold necklace, and the diamond pendant Grandma Rose had left me in her will. Except now the pendant was gone. I stood there, staring at the empty space where it had rested for years, and everything went very still in my head, the way it does right before something breaks. That pendant wasn't just sentimental. It was one of the only family heirlooms I had that came with a clear, undeniable connection to love that hadn't been corrupted by control. Grandma Rose had given it to me herself, in her tiny kitchen over tea and stale cookies, with tears in her eyes and a whisper in her voice. "Keep this safe, sweetheart. It's yours." I marched back to the living room. "Where is it?" I asked. And this time I didn't bother with the calm tone. My voice cracked like a whip. Kyle didn't flinch. "I needed money," he said, as if that explained anything. "And they weren't going to give it to me again, so I figured you'd understand." "You stole from me," I said, and hearing the words out loud made it worse. "You stole something Grandma gave me, and you sold it, or pawned it?" He stood up now, arms out, as if trying to play peacemaker in a war he'd started. "I was going to get it back. It was just a short-term thing." "Don't," I cut in. "Don't lie to me. Not about this." "I had no choice," he said. And then the real truth spilled out like poison. They were cutting me off, too. After New Year's, Dad said I was too old to keep leeching off the family account. Sound familiar? I stared at him, suddenly understanding. The timing, the awkward silences, Dad's stupid toast. This wasn't just about me. It had been a coordinated ambush. Or worse, a final performance of control disguised as holiday wisdom. They threw me under the bus, I whispered. Kyle didn't answer. He didn't have to. And that's when I realized the deeper betrayal. It wasn't just about money. It was about legacy, about choosing which child to invest in, which one to believe in, which one to break first. And somewhere along the way, they had decided I was strong enough to survive the cold, while Kyle still needed the illusion of warmth. But that illusion was breaking fast, and the cracks were only getting louder. The next few days passed in a kind of muted haze, where everything around me felt like it had lost its sharpness, as if the world itself had blurred at the edges and refused to come back into focus. The pendant was gone, Kyle wasn't talking, my parents were walking around the house like aging monarchs who sensed a revolt brewing in the walls, and I couldn't shake the sense that something else was out of place, something deeper than financial betrayal or stolen heirlooms. There was a current running under everything, a quiet hum of rot just beneath the wallpaper of our lives, and no matter how many times I tried to convince myself I had uncovered the worst of it, some buried instinct kept tugging me forward. It started with a memory, one I hadn't thought of in years. I was 15, sitting on the top step of the attic ladder, watching my mother cry in silence. She didn't know I was there. She was kneeling on the closet floor, her hands buried in a bob, shoulders shaking like she was trying to cry without making noise. At the time, I assumed it was about Kyle. Everything was back then. But now, with the smell of dust and old perfume still burned into the back of my brain, I wondered if it had been something else entirely. I could still see her hand pulling out a letter, unfolding it with trembling fingers, and reading it like it was the only thing tethering her to sanity. The attic was a mess of half-forgotten seasons, collapsed cardboard, and yellowed linens. But the closet beneath the slanted beam in the back, my mother's old storage closet, was still intact, still locked, and still untouched. That alone was suspicious. Carol wasn't the kind of woman to keep secrets, unless she wanted you to find them eventually. She was the queen of carefully curated discoveries, the kind of person who'd leave a diary half open if she needed you to read it, or forget a check stub on purpose when she wanted to start a conversation without having to admit vulnerability. But this closet, this had stayed sealed for decades, and that was enough to raise every hair on my arms. I didn't ask for permission. I found the spare key in the blue ceramic bowl by the coat rack where she kept loose batteries and breath mints and the mystery keys no one could remember the use for. The lock clicked open with a mechanical sigh, and the door creaked just enough to remind me that sometimes old wood remembers pain. Inside was a wall of garment bags, wedding dresses, prom gowns, a baptismal shawl folded neatly in a dry cleaner's plastic. But it wasn't the clothes that caught my eye. It was the shoe boxes, stacked too neatly in the corner, each labeled in Carol's blocky, perfect handwriting: taxes, receipts, Kyle's report cards, Emily's art projects, and one, unmarked, pushed behind the others like it was never meant to be pulled forward. I sat cross-legged on the floor and opened it. Inside, tied with a faded blue ribbon, was a bundle of letters. Dozens of them. Old envelopes, many of them postmarked from cities I didn't recognize. Wichita, Providence, Portland. Some were addressed to my mother. Some, strangely, were addressed to no one. But the handwriting was the same, elegant, confident, and absolutely not my father's. My breath caught as I picked one up and unfolded it. The paper was worn soft from years of handling, but the ink had held. It began simply, "Carol, you were never meant to stay in that house." I read through 3 before I realized what I was holding. Love letters. Real, gut-wrenching personal confessions of a man pouring his heart out to my mother over what appeared to be years. There were references to late-night phone calls, to rendezvous during business trips, to shared books and songs and regrets. And then, on the 4th letter, I saw a name. When I held Emily that first time, I thought, God, she has your eyes. I froze. The letter fell from my hands. There was no mistaking the implication. This man, Charles, was not some distant admirer. He was someone who believed he had held me as a baby, who believed he had a right to feel paternal. I flipped the page and read more quickly now, not caring how my hands trembled. Frank may never admit it, but he knows. He's always known. He just made his peace by pretending you're both doing what's best for her. But I see her. I see how she walks alone, even in a room full of people. I see how she learned silence before words. I couldn't read anymore. The nausea hit me all at once, hot and low and angry. My head throbbed with questions I didn't want to voice, and every memory of my childhood began rearranging itself in the background like broken furniture being slowly reassembled into a different room. The tone of my father's voice, the disappointment that never had a clear source, the way my mother sometimes looked at me with guilt instead of pride. The quiet fights late at night I thought were about Kyle. What if they weren't? I put the letters back in the box, but one envelope didn't fit. It was thicker, sealed, and had my name written across the front in the same confident hand. Emily, if you ever find out. I sat on the edge of the closet for what felt like an hour, just holding it. The weight of it in my hand felt like a decision, a moral fork in the road. Part of me didn't want to open it, because once you break a seal like that, you can't pretend anymore. You can't unknow the truth. You either accept it, or you let it burn you from the inside out. I thought about burying it back in the box, pretending I'd never seen it, letting my mother keep whatever version of the past she'd curated so carefully, but I couldn't. So I peeled the flap open. Inside wasn't just a letter, it was a photograph. My mother, younger, maybe 25, holding a newborn in a hospital bed. And standing beside her, smiling down at the baby, with eyes too familiar to mistake, was a man I'd never seen before in my life. And it wasn't Frank, not even close. There's something uniquely violent about a truth that arrives too late. It doesn't burst into the room like a confession or roll in slowly like a storm. It crashes through your sense of self like a train with no brakes, leveling everything you thought was solid. That photograph in my hand, wrinkled at the corners and slightly faded around the edges, felt heavier than any piece of paper should. The man in it, smiling down at my newborn face, didn't need a name tag for me to know exactly who he was. I didn't recognize his face in the sense that I had ever seen him before, but something in the lines of his expression and the shape of his eyes told me exactly what the letters had only hinted at. This was Charles, and this was the moment my entire history had been rewritten without my permission. I didn't cry. I wish I had, because it might have made the next few hours feel less like I was watching someone else's life implode. Instead, I sat in silence, the sealed envelope now open like a wound across my lap, and read the letter slowly, deliberately, as if trying to delay the inevitable shattering of the last pieces of my illusion. It began gently, almost apologetically, as if the man who wrote it had carried his guilt for so long that the paper itself couldn't bear its weight. He said he'd met my mother when they were both in their 20s, at some regional banking conference in Minneapolis. He was married at the time, so was she. What began as a handful of polite conversations turned into late-night phone calls, hotel rooms, quiet promises neither of them ever planned to keep, until I happened. He wrote that my mother hadn't told him about the pregnancy until after I was born, and by then she had already made a choice. She told Charles that Frank would raise me as his own, that it was better this way, cleaner, easier, and safer. But he hadn't agreed. He'd pushed for visitation, for shared acknowledgement, for any scrap of a role in my life. She refused. She said Frank needed to believe I was his, or the marriage wouldn't survive. She told Charles that she owed it to her son Kyle to keep the family intact, that no one needed to know, especially not me. And so, for the next 40 years, he waited. He sent letters she rarely answered. He watched from afar, finding my school photos in newsletters or public albums. He said he came to one of my piano recitals once, but left before the curtain fell because he couldn't bear the risk of being recognized. And he had saved everything, copies of correspondence, photographs, records, all of it tucked away in a safety deposit box, which he said would be released to me if I ever contacted the lawyer whose name was scribbled at the bottom of the page. I remember blinking at that name for a full minute, trying to decide whether I should be furious or numb. What I felt was neither. It was something colder, disgust, not at him, not even really at my mother, but at the whole calculated, pristine facade they had forced me to live under. They didn't just lie to me. They built an entire mythology around that lie and made me kneel at its altar every day of my life. The punishments I got for being too loud, the silence I was praised for, the distance Frank always maintained as if I carried something contagious. That hadn't been disappointment. That had been resentment. And I had swallowed it for years, thinking it was love in its most disciplined form. I didn't go downstairs that night. I couldn't bear the sound of the television buzzing in the living room, or my mother's nightly ritual of washing dishes like she was performing for an invisible camera crew. I locked my bedroom door and lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling as if the right crack would split open and reveal something honest. The next morning, I didn't wait for anyone to wake up. I got dressed, made a fresh copy of the photograph, and walked into the kitchen just as my father was pouring himself a second cup of coffee. He didn't say good morning, he never did. We had long ago passed the threshold where small talk felt like anything other than a threat. I slid the photo across the table. He looked down at it and blinked once, then reached for his mug. "You knew," I said. I didn't pose it as a question. He didn't answer right away. Just studied the picture like it was an invoice that didn't quite add up. "Your mother made her choice," he said eventually, his voice stripped of anything resembling emotion. "And I made mine." I waited for more, but that was it. That was all he would offer. No apology, no explanation. Just that cold, unwavering belief that he had sacrificed something noble, and I was supposed to thank him for it. "You raised me out of what? Duty?" I asked, my voice cracking under the strain of holding back years of hurt. "Spite? Were you trying to prove a point?" He looked at me then, his eyes as sharp as they had always been when he delivered punishments or declared verdicts. "I raised you because it was the right thing to do, because I wasn't going to let your mother destroy this family with one mistake." "One mistake?" I said, laughing without humor. "You think that's what I am? A mistake?" "No," he said, calmly. "You were a consequence." I left the kitchen before I did something I would regret. My hands were shaking, not from sadness, but from the fury that comes when you realize your life has been a stage play written by other people, and your only job was to hit your mark and speak your lines. Back in my room, I folded the letter, the photograph, and my own quiet rage into an envelope and put it in my desk drawer. Not because I wanted to keep it safe, but because I knew there would come a day when I needed to show someone else, maybe Kyle, maybe nobody at all, that I had proof, that I wasn't crazy. Because even though the lies had unraveled, the real story wasn't over. Not yet. There was still one thing I hadn't figured out. If Charles had left me this letter, if he'd gone to all this trouble, then why had my mother kept it hidden? Why bury it in a box instead of destroying it? Unless somewhere deep down she had wanted me to find it all along. The air inside that house had always carried a strange weight, a thickness that settled on your skin like invisible dust. But after the letter and the photograph, it became almost unbearable. Each wall felt closer than the day before. Every floorboard creaked like it was holding secrets it was dying to spill. And even the soft hum of the refrigerator seemed louder somehow, like it was trying to interrupt the silence that now stretched between me and the people I used to call my family. It wasn't just tension anymore. It was grief. Grief for a life that had never really been mine. Grief for a story I had spent 40 years believing in, only to find out that the plot had been written by someone else. The myth of who I was, who I came from, what our family stood for. It had all collapsed, and now I was left standing in the debris, trying to make sense of what pieces were worth salvaging. For the next few days, no one said much. My mother busied herself with crossword puzzles and overbrewed tea, pretending like she hadn't just been exposed as the architect of a 40-year deception. Kyle disappeared during daylight hours, probably drowning his guilt and resentment at some friend's apartment, although he still returned to the couch every night with the same stale excuses and the same worn-out hoodie. My father, ever the stoic, moved through the house like a man finishing a job he never wanted in the first place. He folded laundry that wasn't his. He took out the trash without being asked. He scraped ice off the front porch before sunrise. He didn't speak to me unless absolutely necessary, and even then his voice came out hollow, like it had been emptied of anything human a long time ago. But something had shifted inside me, and not in a small, subtle way. I had spent so many years absorbing their moods, tiptoeing around their tempers, trying to decode what version of me would keep the peace that I hadn't noticed how much of my life had been edited to make them comfortable. I had shaped myself into something tolerable. I had become efficient, quiet, and useful, an emotional sponge that absorbed every bitter comment and smiled through every backhanded compliment. And now, finally, I had stopped caring. Not out of cruelty, not out of revenge, but out of sheer exhaustion. I had nothing left to give them. No more patience, no more space, no more performance. The morning I decided to leave, it wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting match, no final blow-up. I simply woke up, sat on the edge of my bed with the letter still tucked into my desk drawer, and realized I didn't want to waste another sunrise in a house built on lies. I packed quietly, just one suitcase, a few clothes, my laptop, the necklace that Kyle hadn't managed to pawn, and the photo of me as a baby, the one that proved I had been loved, even if it was inconvenient. I made a copy of the house deed and slid it into an envelope with a typed note that read, "You have 30 days. After that, you start paying rent, or you leave." I placed it on the kitchen table beneath a mug that said "World's Best Dad," a cruel little irony I couldn't resist. My mother walked in while I was zipping up my suitcase. She looked at me for a long time, the way people do when they want to say something but know they've lost the right. Her eyes were red-rimmed, not from fresh tears, but from the kind of crying that happens quietly over several days, the kind that builds up behind closed doors and chokes you in your sleep. She opened her mouth, then closed it. I didn't help her find the words. I just stood there, waiting, letting the weight of her silence answer the questions she didn't ask. "You could have told me," I finally said, not because I expected an apology, but because I needed her to hear the hurt for what it was. Not anger, not betrayal, just a bone-deep sadness that I had carried for far too long. "I was trying to protect you," she whispered, and the line fell so flat it almost made me laugh. "No," I said, "you were protecting yourself, and you convinced yourself that was the same thing." She didn't argue. She didn't chase me. She just nodded slowly, like someone being forced to watch a movie they thought they directed, only to realize they were just an extra in the background. I walked out of that room with no fanfare. No hugs, no tears, just the dull echo of my own footsteps on the floor that had once held birthday parties, school mornings, and endless, stifling Christmas dinners. Outside, the sky was heavy with snow clouds, but the air was crisp, clear, and mercifully quiet. I loaded the suitcase into my trunk and paused for a moment, staring back at the house through the windshield. Kyle was watching me from the front window, arms crossed, expression unreadable. I didn't wave. I didn't wait for him to come outside. I turned the key, felt the engine roar to life, and pulled away without looking back again. The drive was long, and somewhere between the turnpike and the first gas station, I realized that for the first time in my adult life, I didn't know what was coming next. And I didn't care. I wasn't heading toward a plan or a person. I wasn't on some noble quest for closure. I wasn't even sure I believed in that anymore. What I had was space. Space to figure out who I was when I wasn't trying to be their daughter, their disappointment, their scapegoat, their emotional insurance policy. And yet, as the miles stretched out in front of me, one thought kept circling like a vulture just out of reach. I had taken control. I had told them the truth. I had walked away. But what did that make me? A survivor, or just a different kind of liar? Because no matter how far I drove, I could still feel the shape of their expectations pressing against my skin, and some small, traitorous part of me wondered if I had inherited more from them than just blood. Maybe I had learned their language too well. The emotional distance, the cold calculations, the ability to cut ties with surgical precision and call it growth. Maybe walking away wasn't strength. Maybe it was just what cowards called peace. And maybe I wouldn't know the difference until it was too late.